evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and reconsider what you know of the news of the day. So we're 2 years into the Madani administration and promises of reform have often taken centre stage. But Suaram's 2024 Human Rights Report challenges us to look beyond the rhetoric. Now today on the show, we'll unpack the state of human rights in Malaysia and ask, is the Madani government making progress on the reforms promised, or is there a troubling disconnect between action and ambition? So joining us on the show today is Sevan Doraisamy, who is the Executive Director of the NGO Suara Rakyat Malaysia, or Suaram, and Jernell Tan, who is Suaram's Documentation and Monitoring Coordinator. Welcome to the show, both of you. Good to have you back on the show. So let's talk a little bit about, as we wrap up 2024, if I may start with you, Sevan, how would you describe the overall state of human rights in Malaysia this year? Were there any marked differences that you'd like to highlight?
Thank you, Melisa. Thank you for having us. If you talk about 2024, a year back during our report launch in 2023, we did came out with a statement saying that there's like a long list of expectation with the current Prime Minister, and he said if he failed to do it, he can be considered in terms of delivering reforms. He can be considered one of the worst Prime Minister if he don't deliver, because there's a expectation is larger compared to the previous Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister talks the language. He's from the Reformasi movement, and he's been committed to reform when he was with the opposition, as well as during his first year. So when we said that, he said, okay, give us some time. So now it's like past 1 year. So we are into the second year, and what we are seeing currently is slow progress. And when you see slow progress, with those promises and with this, so many issues that he also at once gone through because of the state repression and all that, it is disappointing to see the slow progress. So it is also disappointing to see sometimes we see the government don't have the direction or proper direction in terms of like a timeline to put forward how the progress is going to happen. Okay, for example, this issue related to detention without trial laws, because that's our core business. If you have those issues like SOSMA, POCA and POTA, and at one point of time we were promised that this law being, some laws will be repealed, some law will be amended. But after 2 years, you don't see any movement there. So that's disappointing. Or in some cases, there are some movement, but very slow. But you also don't see the proper timeline they're given. But I would say there are more engagement compared to previous government with regards reform issues. There are engagements. They kind of like now consider the civil society organization as part of the stakeholders. So we've been spending our time to engage with them, talking to them, put forward the ideas, the recommendation, all that. But sometimes you don't see what happened next. Where do we go from here, the next? So you are wondering, you are at the limbo.
Right.
So that's what's happening now.
Okay. Well, Jernell, do you share the same sentiment? I mean, what are for you the most significant issues that happened this year that you highlighted in the report?
I think I'll just briefly glance across the 4 areas. For misuse of security laws, I would say one of the most significant findings for us is actually the resurgence in terrorist-related detentions, accompanied by an increase in organised crime-related detentions under the Security Offences Special Measures Act 2012. If I were to jump to, let's say, deaths in custody, for instance, we've definitely seen, well, generally speaking, deaths in custody, it's already underreported. So let's say we were to say we had 14 cases last year, and if you look at official data, normally it would hover, let's say for police deaths in custody, normally it would hover around double digits, but last year we got 14. But this year, if you were to add on, let's say, the most recent KLIA death in custody involving a British national, we only have 6. So that's very, very significant dip by at least 60%, for instance. In terms of freedom of expression, we would say that's one of the most, that's an area where you would see a crazy amount of developments. One is Sedition
So this
Act.
year was a lot on freedom of expression.
It's crazy. Legislative developments coupled with all the cases, it's been insane actually. Especially, you know, we would know about the recent CMA amendments and all that. So if you put that aside, if you just focus on the cases, right? Sedition Act cases, more or less consistent. It's just that we have paid our attention quite closely to actually how fast the prosecutions were brought about. The fastest we've seen is actually 4 to 5 days. The slowest was actually 2.5 months, which is still relatively short, and that's for Sedition Act. And all of it involved royalty-related cases. For Section 233 of the Communications and Multimedia Act, we've seen an uptick in 3R-related investigations, and of course, the consistent trend in concurrent use of other laws to investigate people. So normally you would see Section 233 being paired with the Sedition Act, sometimes even Sections 504, 505, and 500. And concerningly as well, Section 233 and the Sedition Act are also used against journalists, and we've also seen quite a few. If I were to jump to freedom of assembly, there is an increase by over 60% in arrests, by over 50% in investigations, which contradict significantly compared to, let's say, the rhetoric put forward by the Home Minister Saifuddin Nasution, because he said that the government respects freedom of assembly. So technically, if you were to respect freedom of assembly, shouldn't you be downscaling your investigations? And you know, you shouldn't be even imposing, let's say, bureaucratic barriers for organizers to organize peaceful assemblies. But this is just a snapshot.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for laying that out. That was very comprehensive. I have kind of a bird's eye view of sort of the key areas. I do have to ask though, I mean, you focused on where there were problematic uses of state apparatus to repress maybe civil liberties. Were there areas where there was an expansion of civil liberties and human rights? Were there areas where there was progress made, upholding even what we have come to take for granted sometimes? Sevan, any thoughts?
Okay, there are a few areas that I would say it's not only particularly in past 1 year, but we have been progressing in terms of, for example, the public assembly. Those days we need a permit. Now, after the change of law in 2012 and then amendment in 2017, if I remember correctly, all you need is notification. You just notify the police 5 days prior to the event, the public assembly, and then you just go ahead.
So you don't need a permit anymore?
No permit at all.
Okay.
So, but then sometimes we still hearing the statements from the police saying that, oh, they are illegal group. So you can't declare any formation of assembly as illegal because they did not adhere that 5 days notice. So, I mean, the law does not give the right to the police to say that it's illegal in that context. So what we are doing is try to like fight back the same narrative. So sometimes the police come out with statements say, so they don't have permit. No, we don't require a permit nowadays.
I don't think the public knows that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, some know, some don't know because of this misleading, and we have to like come out with a statement and re-emphasize those things, and then the IGP came out and saying, yes, you don't have to have a permit nowadays. So that's some incidents. So we have progress on that side. How they are dealing with, for example, the politician and political dissenters as well as members from civil society, if they got arrested under sedition and all that, CMA, sometimes the way they treat have improved a lot comparatively. They kind of like, they know, okay, this is 3R related, so you have to like take your statement and all that. But we want a similar kind of like a treatment or similar kind of a pattern to be also applied to any criminal suspect.
Right.
So you only declare them a criminal after the court process. The court have the right to declare. So you don't, because we also have a record of police using violence to get information and all that. So torture practice is still, for us, is rampant still. But at one hand, you can like follow the process, the procedures. On the other hand, you have a double standard when it comes to a crime suspect or terrorist suspect.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I were to zoom in on the peaceful assembly, the freedoms for peaceful assembly, let's talk a little bit about that. So there are there's an ability now to gather and assemble peacefully to air out whatever protest or dissent that you might have, but the concern here is what happens during and after?
Even
is it
before, actually.
even before? Okay, walk me through that, because how do we think about it? The fact that we're able to gather and assemble peacefully, but is that intimidation? Are we talking about? Are we talking about investigation? What does the right to peacefully assemble entail? Does it mean that I can assemble peacefully without being investigated or intimidated after that? I mean, walk us through how you view this right.
So essentially, at least in our analysis, we sort of look at how the police treats protesters and organizers before, during, and after.
Okay.
So what we've seen from the police, which has been going on for a while, regardless of administration, is actually things like, for example, for some protests that may be, quote unquote, a little bit more sensitive. So let's say if we talk about the demo Lawan Anwar, for instance, right?
So kind of anti-current administration.
Yeah, so-called anti-administration, or let's say on certain other issues related to royalty, or if you want to talk about race, for example, even some of the pro-Palestine assemblies, for instance, let's say held by certain opposition groups, right? They tend to get certain treatments that are otherwise not so much seen in other assemblies. So for example, let's say the Demo Rakyat Lawan Anwar one, for instance, they got the pre-rally warning involving the police, where the police literally informs the public that you shouldn't attend this assembly because they have not done this, that. So for us, this actually does have a chilling effect on freedom of assembly, because especially we have this authority culture that's still prevalent. And not to mention there were quite a few instances where the police has mischaracterized, the so-called requirements for assemblies. So one of it is, of course, as what Stephen has highlighted, the notice versus permit language. So in some police stations, or at least by certain police spokespersons, you may not find the issue of permit versus notice.
Right.
But in some other states, for example, if you look at the Kami Mau Air Rally, for instance, right, involving the University Malaysia Sabah students, right, the Kota Kinabalu police chief actually used the term permit instead of notice. So you still see that inconsistency across different police stations across the districts. Another one that's extremely important we would like to highlight is actually the so-called need for landowners' permission. So most of the assemblies are held in public spaces. So by right, we do not need the landowner's permission because it's public property, right? But you would find that police still issues announcements calling XYZ assembly as illegal or against the law because they, quote unquote, did not get the landowner's permission.
It's a property.
It's a property owners. So this is down to kind of semantics of using the technicalities to dissuade people or to discourage people from.
Yeah, but even that, Melisa, if we wanted to do a protest, most of the time we wanted to do it in the Independence Square, Merdeka, Dataran Merdeka, right? So, and then the police said, oh, there's some event going on, or you need to get approval from the property owner. The property owner, quote unquote, it's technically is the people. It's a public space.
Right.
Right. Public space. It's a people's space, and the so-called property owner is the guardian of the public property.
Okay. So not the owner.
Not the owner. The council, the majlis, or the DBKL are the guardian of the public property. But because of a language, harta benda Datuk Bandar. So it's not harta benda Datuk Bandar. Once Datuk Bandar dah tukar, dia tak ada bawa. He won't bring back the property.
It's not his or her asset.
Exactly. So it's a property of the public. The guardian is the Datuk Bandar or the mayor or the council. Then public have to be allowed. Because we have been progressed. Public assembly, most of the time, end up in no incidents, right? 2 hours, you gather, you did what you wanted to say, and then it's done, you disperse peacefully. So that's our, what's been happening now. So you need to reconsider back, allow public to have our peaceful gathering in Dataran Merdeka.
Right.
So it's many years is pending.
So I have heard this argument for the proponents of this current administration. They say, well, if we were to compare the Madani government to the previous ones, they argue that, listen, it's slightly better, right, compared to the previous ones. That is an achievement in itself. I want to know how you both feel about that. Let's use the peaceful assembly as an example, that there are now more the ability to gather peacefully in public. What do you make of the argument of the adequacy of at least better than before. Sevan, how do you? I'm sure you've counted this comment before. How do you?
Yeah, so at least
it?
better than previous government. So you are trying to settling for the least, right? So we don't consider that as a progress. You see, when time buys, probably a place, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, in 60s is what is different. In 90s is what different. There is a progress. But the progress is inevitable, right? Along the time, you will have a building, you will have a road and all that. Then how you wanted to say, oh, in 60s and now look at the KL, we have progressed, we have developed. No, some developments go together with the time, right? But what you brought in drastically in this context as institutional reform, there's so many areas, right? Detention without trial laws, some sedition and restricting of expression laws, and some other areas as well. So there can be some progress, I agree. There was also progress in terms of stakeholders engagement, more coming. Yes, these are the least things. Yes, at least they are better, correct. But we want more. And you've been speaking the same language, most of them, even including the Home Minister. He was one time he was against the ISA with the movement. Now he's like defending the use of SOSMA and other detention without trial. So that's disappointing. So where is the least here? And for our disappointment, the Home Minister is kind of like we did not get any engagement or any opening to have a proper discussion with him.
With the Home Minister?
Yes.
Suaram has not yet been able to engage the Home Ministry.
But if you see a lot of our work, you need to sit with the Home Minister and the people.
Security laws fall under them, for sure. Jernell, what do you make of this argument, the adequacy of being at least better than those before?
Definitely not, because if you look at, if we look at the notice, I'm sure you're aware of the amendments, right, the Peaceful Assembly Act amendments that reduced the notification period from 10 to 5 days. That took place in 2019 during the PH's time. Procedure-wise, we have definitely not seen any improvement. By that, we're referring to the notice versus permit stuff, the landowner's permission, the post-rally investigations that tend to happen still, even if organisers may have complied with the notice period. So those practices have not changed at all. So at least from that particular angle, at least probably not too much of an improvement from the Madani government side. At least in terms of the freedom of assembly as exercised by the Rakyat, there is definitely an increase. We would probably say most likely due to an increase in awareness by the public, and also like the willingness to actually talk about certain issues a lot more, especially with the pro-Palestine issues, right? Because especially this is a current one. So at least in our from our perspective, not too much of an improvement on the government's front when it comes to managing peaceful assemblies or policing peaceful assemblies, but exercise of this freedom by the public, yes, it's increased.
Well, let's use this argument and take the example of the use of security laws. Suaram has documented a sharp increase in SOSMA-related cases arrests this year, particularly in terrorism and organised crime. You mentioned a bit earlier, Jernell. How do we think that through? That they're using this law more frequently, but they're using it for national security issues. So there are those who might say, well, even though this is a problematic security law, at least it's being used to make the country safer. Again, at least it's being used. Sevan?
That's basically a perception. There are so many countries who have faced larger threat compared to what we are here. They don't confine to use of this security law. I would say we are not against any security law, but the security law which have the detention without trial notion.
Detention without
trial. So
trial.
there's many countries have get rid of all these detention without trial laws because they wanted to properly investigate and then expose what really happened so that everyone aware and the national security not really confined to the police or home ministry alone. It's our national responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. So you need to be aware, you need to know what is happening under this law and what was the investigation is about. Although we don't want to interfere in those investigations, once it's done, we need to know what happened, right? So that's why an open court trial is also important. And currently under these circumstances, in most of the security offences, the first instances they use the regular criminal procedure, and then after that they suddenly switch it to SOSMA. And then initially the Home Minister will come out with a statement saying that, like for example, the Ulu Tiram Johor incidents, initially they said, oh, the suspect of terrorist act, and then after a day they said, no, nothing about terrorism act. Right. And then after a few days they like switch back to SOSMA. So it's really confusing. And then the term called chain remand, it means you arrest using the CPC, and then after that you're using a SOSMA. So it means you extended the remand order for many days, but what happened during the investigation you won't know until the trial process happens. But the trial process is most of the time it will be delayed and delayed and delayed, and then unless the whole process is done, then only you can be released. Wow. So if the court finds you are not guilty, how about the years you spent under these provisions of the law?
Okay.
So,
right. Jernell, any thoughts you want to add on the fact that this is a long-standing issue that you have been looking at and speaking out against, but the use of these laws for specifically terrorism-related, organized crime-related, how do you feel about that?
Organized crime related, at least we feel that the extension by rearrest under SOSMA is basically the police not leveraging the resources that they have and the time that they have under the normal remand process to carry out investigations. Because if the public does get to scrutinize our report, they would find that there are a couple of examples that we've listed to actually highlight the contradictions, or at least the questions that we should be asking to the police. Because, for example, let's take the recent GISBH case, right? If we're not mistaken, I think the operation started quite early on. Was it early September, right? And in less than 2 weeks after the operation first started, I believe the Bukit Aman Criminal Investigation Department chief actually announced that the police was already suspecting organized crime elements. And a few days later, the first batch of people who were rearrested under SOSMA were first remanded under the CPC. So at least our question is, if you're already putting out to the public that you're suspecting organized crime elements, and if you were already investigating multiple leads at the same time, encompassing human trafficking, child exploitation, money laundering, etc., why can't you just add organized crime into your leads and already investigate under the usual remand process? Then why would you need to use SOSMA to rearrest the same individuals again? So it doesn't make sense to us, at least. So that's just one example. And if you look at the RM 1.25 million extortion case, right? Out of the 10 police officers who were rearrested, right?
So the SOSMA was used against police officers?
Yes. So if you remember the Israeli firearms case that took place earlier this year, right? And after that, there's this, just suddenly out of nowhere, a few police officers were arrested first, and then they were rearrested under SOSMA, and they labeled this whole case as a RM 1.25 million extortion syndicate activity. But if you look at the follow-up reports, only 2 police officers were charged. And they were not under organized crime at all. Under the MECC Act, and I can't remember the section, but it was for cheating. So it's for corruption. But they were using SOSMA to investigate, which is not warranted, because if you were to already investigate the Israeli firearms case, and you were to already be aware that this bunch of police officers may have done something, why would you need to rearrest?
Yeah, just the existence of this law allows for its abuse, and the lack of transparency behind it is so worrying. In the time that we have left, I do want to ask, I mean, we have so much to cover, but I would recommend to the public to peruse the Suaram report. I mean, there's detention, so we talked about detention trial, but there's also deaths in custody, orang indigenous rights, orang asli rights. So when we think about what's to come ahead, I mean, are you going to be ramping up the pressure come year 3 of this administration? And what in particular would you like to see prioritize? So when we have you back in December 2025, I can ask you, Sevan, did you see progress in this area? What was it, if I may ask the both of you the same question. Sevan, what would you like to see in 2025?
One, I wanted to see serious input by the ministries, especially in our case, Home Minister, for the reform agenda. So it's not like your initial opening line is not remain as a rhetoric, right, every time. Like, for example, the security law itself, you already have all the provisions in the penal code. Why you wanted to continue use the SOSMA procedure? SOSMA is a procedure, like CPC is another procedure, but you have to go to the penal code to charge someone. You can't charge someone under SOSMA. It's just procedure. So how the amendments can be done? So sit, talk to us, right? Why you need 28 days, a blanket? Can you bring to the court 7 days after another 7 days? It's enough time. So that kind of a discussion, we wanted to see some progress the next 1 year. Similarly, in other areas, right, freedom of expression, for example, now largely confined to anything you critical on, not only 3R, sometimes they try to, like, if you criticize on the government and all that, there's so many laws we wanted to focus on expression, right? So you can reduce all of them. And definitely other laws like a public assembly, why you need to summon us after the event, there's no incidents, the police have multiple recording on the events, why you still need to summon us to record our statement. So all these old practices you need to discuss, and you have to put a timeline how you wanted to, like, progress. If you see the timeline, at least there is accountability from the government as well. So we are talking about accountability, but you don't put a standard and also timeline. It's also difficult for us to say you're progressing.
Right. Jernell.
Okay. Well, given the CMA amendments that were passed recently, at least our stance is to repeal sections 211 and 233. If possible, withdraw the amendments that were passed. Actually, you know what? When it gets to Dewan Negara, make sure that the CMA...
It doesn't pass. Okay.
Yes, it doesn't pass. Make sure that
they throw it out.
Select committee... yes, because they're absolutely ridiculous. So at least, because the thing is, some of the public who are keeping tabs on this development would know that the CMA amendments, they were not referred to a PSSC despite suggestions from MPs. But on the other hand, the MCMC Act amendments went through the PSSC for review. So at least for the CMA amendments, it's important that when it gets to Dewan Negara, that it gets scrutinized by a special select committee. Okay. That's extremely important. For the Printing, Press and Publications Act, don't proceed with the amendments. We have temporarily, well, civil society has temporarily delayed them, but no matter what, do not proceed with them, because it will really, really curtail media freedom, and of course, like our friends in the media. Deaths in custody-wise, something that I can bring up would be, because some of us would be aware that there is a task force in force right now for 6 months, producing a report hopefully by mid next year, on how the recommendations on death and custody prevention can be implemented. So we really want to see concrete implementation of these recommendations, because we're already aware of the issues day in, day out.
Yes.
What's missing is implementation.
Okay. Thank you both for highlighting such important issues as we look back at how we progress as a country of the year. Thank you for your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.